It's finally time to show you guys the build that I've been using for the past couple of months. A custom loop build, of course, in the Meshlicious case from Sunny Side Up Design. In terms of hardware, I'm reusing the same components from my previous Formed T1 build. The RTX 3080 FE, of course, paired with EK Special Edition water block. And do check my previous video where I do a full disassembly and cleanup of this particular block. Moving on, we have the trusty Ryzen 9 5900X with the EK Quantum Velocity water block. Again, same motherboard as before, the B550i Aorus Pro from Gigabyte. One of my primary goals with this build was to use a D5 pump instead of the usual low power DCLT pumps I've featured before. And the pump I'll be using here is the Aquacomputer D5 Next. I'm also using the ULTITOP pump cover, and there is actually a very good reason for this, which I will explain a bit later on in the video. To top it off, I'm throwing in a tiny reservoir from Bitspower. As you can probably tell by now, I'm pulling out all the stops on this one. Let's see how we managed to fit all of this inside the case. I already have the power supply and the radiator installed here, because the pump needs to be mounted very precisely. The radiator I'm using is the Hardware Labs GDS 280, which with the Arctic P14 fans provides just enough clearance for my pump assembly here. Two of these mounting holes line up nicely with the slots on the bottom, but I went ahead and drilled out an extra hole, this being the only permanent mod I've done to the case. The next step was to add the pump control unit onto the mount. Here I should also mention the custom silicone cables, which are super soft and much easier to work with. Very important considering the tight clearance between the PSU and the radiator. For comparison, here's one of my previous custom cables, unsleeved and PVC coated. You can still achieve a high bend radius, but the cable doesn't really want to cooperate. A silicone cable feels more like cooked spaghetti, while a PVC coated cable feels more like a solid core wire. Sleeved cables are somewhere in between, but they are thicker and they take up more volume. Before we move on, I should also mention the riser standoff mod. Adding a 25mm M3 spacer shifts the position of the GPU, creating space for cable management as well as some additional breathing room between the GPU backplate and the spine of the case. Moving on, the pump itself fits right in place. This is the part of the build which I was most worried about, but it seems my eyeball measurements proved to be good enough. I mentioned earlier in the video that there was a very good reason for using the ULTITOP pump cover. This pump cover can be rotated, and what this allows for is to have the output of the pump facing towards the GPU compartment, meaning that we don't have to deal with routing tubes from one side of the case to the other. And finally, the tiny reservoir is added on top of the pump top with a simple male-to-male extension fitting. This is all beginning to look a lot like something you would see in a much larger water-cooled build. Something that shouldn't work in a case this small, but somehow it does. There's of course a lot of advantages that come with a reservoir, most importantly not having to worry about the pump running dry at any time. The next step was to add fittings in preparation for the tube runs. The final detail that could have potentially ended the whole build was clearing the ATX connector on the motherboard. What I ended up doing here is using a non-rotatable 90-degree fitting, which provided just the clearance that I needed. As for the GPU side, things here are pretty straightforward. All that's needed is to connect the pump to the GPU inlet and the GPU outlet to the radiator. Alright, let's look at some numbers. As is tradition with my build so far, Cyberpunk 2077 serves as my baseline, and we can actually get a pretty good idea of how much an improvement this setup is versus the much smaller Form T1 build. As a quick reminder, here are the temps I observed during a similar test on the T1 build. And here we have the new results in the Meshlicious, with the mention that this new test was done at 4K. Same GPU and CPU settings, but we're getting nearly 10 degrees lower coolant temperature with a very reasonable fan speed of 65%. Clearly there's some cooling headroom available here. I did another test, and this time with a less aggressive undervolting. The GPU is still undervolted, but this time with a much higher core frequency, actually beating what this board would achieve under stock settings. As for the CPU, I had it running with PBO enabled and a negative curve optimizer. Even with the new balance settings, the coolant stays under 40 degrees Celsius. I'm really happy with the result here, as it unlocks a bit more performance from these parts. And finally, I did another 30-minute test, this time in Red Dead Redemption 2. The results are pretty much identical. In daily use, I'm running the fans based on the coolant temperature. The D5 Next pump has an integrated fan controller, RGB header, as well as a water temperature sensor, which is very convenient. I'm still not a huge fan of the software, but it does get the job done. That's pretty much all for now, but I suspect I will have a follow-up video on this build at some point in the future. I have some ideas for it, like replacing the ZMT tubing and doing an acrylic hardline version. I think something like that would look really sick and take this to the next level. Until then, as always, thanks a lot for watching.